intellectual domain, compound interest rules. Let's talk about compound interest. Compound interest, most of you should know it in the finance context. If you don't, then crack open a microeconomics textbook. It's worth reading microeconomics textbook through from start to finish. Macroeconomics you can skip for the most part. As Nassim Taleb says, it is much easier to macro bullshit than it is to micro bullshit. So with macroeconomics, there's just so much politics that bleeds into macroeconomics, especially once you're beyond the basics of supply and demand, that it's very hard to tell when you're reading politics with a little bit of mathematics around it and when you're actually reading something that's more fundamental. So compound interest is basically the idea that, let's say if you're earning 10% a year, the first year you make 10% and you end up with, let's say you had $1 you invested, you end up with $1.10. But the next year you end up with $1.21, and the next year you end up with $1.32 or 33. So it keeps adding on itself in such a way that if you're compounding at 30% a year for 30 years, you don't just end up with 10 or 20 times your money, you end up with thousands of times your money. So compound interest is a very powerful concept. But compound interest applies to more than just compounding capital. Compounding capital is just the beginning. Compounding business relationships is very important. If you look at some of the top roles in society, like why does someone get to be a CEO of a public company or be on the board of a public company, or why does someone get to be a banker who's managing $1 billion, is because people trust them. And they trust them because the relationship in which they've worked, the work that they've done, it's kind of compounded. They've stuck with the business and they've shown themselves in a visible and accountable way to be high integrity people. So compound interest can also happen in your reputation. If you have a sterling reputation and you do a good job with it and you keep doing that for decades upon decades, people will notice that, and your reputation will literally end up being thousands to tens of thousands of times as valuable as somebody else who is actually very talented but is not keeping a kind of the compound interest game and reputation going. This is also true when you're working with individual people. So if you've worked with somebody in a business where they're your coworker and you work together for 5 or 10 years and you still enjoy working with them, obviously you trust them. The little foibles are gone. All the negotiations that normally would happen in business relationships can work very, very simply because you just trust each other. You know it'll work out. For example, there's another angel in Silicon Valley, Elad Gil, who I like to do deals with. And the reason I love working with Elad is because I know that when the deal is being done, he will bend over backwards to give me extra. He will always round off in my favor if there's an extra dollar being delivered here or there. If there's some cost to pay, he'll pay it out of his own pocket, and he won't even mention it to me. And because he goes so far out of his way to treat me so well, I send him every deal that I have. I try and include him in everything, and then I go out of my way to try and pay for him. So that relationship just ends up so powerful that the 1 + 1 is more than 2 as investors here. So compounding in those relationships is very valuable. Even like fitness and health, many of you have probably been on various diets and nutrition programs and exercise programs, and you probably noticed that it takes a little while before you kind of go through these growth spurts. And then once you've gone through a spurt, you kind of land at a new level, either you're thinner or you're more muscular, and then you can jump up to the next level from there. Obviously fitness, we're talking about physiological. Compound interest is not going to work anywhere near as strongly as it will in the purely intellectual domain. But in the intellectual domain, compound interest rules. Even when you look at a business that may have 100 users but is growing at a compound rate of 20% a month will very, very quickly stack up to having millions of users. And sometimes even the founders of the companies are surprised by how large the business scales. So when you find the right thing to do, when you find the right people to work with, then just investing deeply into that and sticking with it for decades is really how you make the big bucks and you make the big returns in your relationships and your money. So compound interest is very important.